Got it. Oh, awesome. Welcome to Extension Hot Topics for November. Great to have everybody on today. We're going to give it a few minutes as we let folks on. As always, this program we have for the opportunity to expose and share the information from the different experts on campus and around the state. So we're happy to have everyone here. Because this is recorded and people will be viewing it later on, we do ask that you mute. And then if you do have questions, throw those in the chat box and then we can get those up. So we'll give it another minute or so for folks to get on the call here. And then we'll go ahead and jump into the material. Um, just a friendly reminder that I guess it's not a reminder, but an announcement. We do have our extension Hot Topics season 7 out. So we will get that information out. It was in your email. Thank you all who have registered for that already. We're excited for next year. We've only got one more of these in December, and then we'll pick up back again in January. So, all right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to Extension Hot Topics. Today we are very fortunate to have Dr. Bigelow from campus. He is a turf science professor in the Horticulture and Landscape Architecture Department. Dr. Bigelow has been on campus for, did you say 23 years?
Something like that.
Gotcha. So he does wonderful work in our turf grass industry. This is what I grew up in extension doing. A lot of people talk about lawns. He's the guy who answers the questions, gets the research done, and helps us out. So I am not going to take any more of his time. So Dr. Bigelow, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jeff. Again, my name is Cale Bigelow. I'm a professor here in the Horticulture Landscape Architecture Department. We have 4 faculty that do work in turf research, applied turf research. And so that would include Aaron Patton, who's our, weed ecologist. We've got Dr. Lee Miller, who's our turf grass disease person. Dr. Doug Richmond does a lot of work on our insects, and kind of whatever's left over is what I get to work with. So I do a lot of work on evaluating turfgrass species for lawns, roadsides, golf courses, athletic fields, all that stuff. Also do a fair bit of work in the space of turfgrass nutrition. How do you feed your lawn? And one of the big focuses of our research program has been basically looking at water conservation strategies for particularly for lawns. And so Jeff promised me that along the way that this could be a conversation. So rather than me constantly giving a full-on PowerPoint for the next 45 minutes, please interject as needed. But before we get into a couple things I wanted to talk about today, just a couple pictures of the kinds of things that we're looking at, and like I said, things for almost a couple decades now, looking at
Dr. Bigelow, we lost you on the audio. Still can't hear you.
How about now, Jeff?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay. So the headphones, for whatever reason, decided to disappear on me. So it is what it is.
And then we did lose your PowerPoint as well.
That's fine. There's always, like you said, you've been doing how many of these, and there's always something.
Well, you know what they say, luck favors the prepared, but
Right. So, again,
Perfect.
I was getting into the discussion here. We do some things related to trying to understand how much water is required for our lawns here in central Indiana. If there's ways we can start to be more conservation minded in that space. It all hinges on, planting the right species in your lawn if you want to have a low maintenance lawn. And again, there's probably 5 or 6, primary species that you'll find in lawns in this part of the United States. But, here's just some examples of, some of the studies that,
we conduct, and you can see the top left here, these are some Kentucky bluegrasses that are under acute drought stress. We also have 3 rainout shelters, high tunnels basically, that we put plastic on, and we exclude rainfall from those for periods of time, and see which ones perform the best under those circumstances, which you think the last 2 summers, the last two ends of the summer, September, October 2024 and 2025, we've had some extremely dry conditions, both here and in places like Ohio. And if you look at the drought monitor maps, you can, see how, even up towards where you are, Jeff, getting up towards Fort Wayne, things are really, really dry. So, these kinds of issues are clearly important. Had a graduate student that finished about a year ago, and one of the things that I had him working on was this idea of how many times a week should you be watering your lawn, and how do different species react during that. And he had these programs on the left-hand side. He had 4 different irrigation programs, including a natural rainfall program. But inside of his irrigation programs, what you're seeing in this image, this larger basically 6 plots. That's the irrigation block that he was applying water to. But you can see the performance of the different species based on, how little water or how much water they were actually receiving. And so what this actually demonstrates is, and we'll get to this in a minute, about strengths and weaknesses of different species, but the PRG that you see in that image, excuse me, that stands for perennial ryegrass. And you can see that that's a species that appears to need more water than our turf type tall fescues and our Kentucky bluegrasses that sometimes we have in lawns. Ultimately, like I said, and again, it's close to lunchtime, and maybe somebody's noshing on a little pizza while they're either listening or watching this. But with the Papa John's slogan, better ingredients, better pizza. And so same thing goes for our lawns. And we know that we have superior, more drought tolerant, more resilient turf grass species and cultivars than we did 15, 20 years ago. And so, really trying to encourage people to plant those in new plantings. By the same token, one of the things that we're also doing is, what about people that have an existing tired and old lawn? Are there ways that you can renovate that lawn? Are there ways that you can go in there and potentially passively introduce some of these newer cultivars into those lawns? So this is just an example of some of the questions that we're asking, looking at, could you just take a bagging mower and scalp down and seed into that? Do you need to do like a lot of the professional lawn care companies and, do some sort of an aeration and overseeding? What are the benefits or, differences between aerating versus slit seeding into a lawn? Are there some advantages to possibly using things like compost to try and encourage, better seed soil contact, and really trying to maximize getting some of these new cultivars into those lawns. So this is a study that we've done. We did the end of last year, and we also just repeated it at the end of this year. So it's a little bit of a stay tuned, but the reason that we did it is we had a previous study that we had some encouraging results interseeding into an existing lawn. And that might be a little bit more palatable to a homeowner or, commercial property, instead of completely killing and tilling and doing all those things. But a way to kind of put some of these better genetics into some of these lawns that are going to be performing better over time, and hopefully allowing someone to have a really nice lawn with less effort. So stay tuned on that, or come on down for a field day and take a look at some of these plots.
Hey,
So
Dr. Bigelow, real quick, when you say a lawn is old, do you have like a year number on that? Because I'm thinking we have a lot of our, and I'm going to say this, community members, all I need to do is mow it, right? Well, if you just only mow it for 20 years, what would you say would be a good, how would you determine ages of a lawn, I guess?
and what I showed there in that picture, that can really be done to any lawn, right? And what we do know is that lawns that are 30, 40 years older, that had been seeded back in the day, is those cultivars, a lot of them are more disease prone, a lot of them are less stress tolerant, a lot of them are wimpy, if you will, when we get these acute dry periods. We also know that a lot of landscape contractors for many, many years, we're really excited about perennial ryegrass, and I'll talk about perennial ryegrass here in a moment. About one of its strengths is how quickly it germinates. But that grass is probably one of our most disease-prone grasses that we could potentially have in lawns. So short answer to that question, Jeff, as you well know, talking to me over the years, is it's 100% it depends, right? But if you've got a lawn that's 15, 20 plus years old, it might be, and it's not performing the way that you want it to, it might be worth looking at some sort of a renovation process.
Thank you. Yeah, that's one of the things where a lot of folks don't understand with lawn care. It's never silver bullets. It's always programming. It's long term, and it's going to be lots of inputs over, not lots of inputs, but inputs over time.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, Jeff, that unfortunately a lot of people discount is they think that some of these new, improved, more stress tolerant grasses are expensive, right? And the reality is, the difference in cost at establishment for some of these superior cultivars that we identify in our trials is really just pennies per pound. You're going to pay a little bit more, but we're talking pennies per pound. And the lawn and landscape professionals sometimes, if it's money that's coming out of their pocket, they don't want to pay for the better cultivars. So unfortunately, but we're getting the word out, and I feel like we're getting some better traction there. That these professionals are like, yeah, you're right. I want to do a better job. So
Yeah, I agree. Cool. Thank you.
all right. Again, I want to keep it to 45 minutes, but we'll get as far as we can get. But just want to give you some ideas of some of the things that I want to touch on, and here's just a quick list. But with that in mind, let's jump into like I said, different species for lawns. So here's a list of things that we have historically seen in lawns. That upper this upper area here. Let's see what I got. Laser pointer. This. Can you see my laser pointer?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, this is pretty typical for what we see, anywhere from Indianapolis north is, the Kentucky bluegrass, especially if it's sodded into some of these new communities. Like I said, perennial ryegrass is very, very popular and still in a lot of people's heads is something that they want. Turf type tall fescues. Those we've been doing a lot of work with in my program for about 15 years now, and really just trying to pull apart, some of the potential pitfalls. But turf type tall fescues being very different from our forage types that are oftentimes found in pastures and things. And so getting people to understand that, these turf types, when they go into the garden centers to buy seed, that's what they want. They don't want to buy Kentucky 31. And then there's a lot of advantages to having mixtures. This perennial ryegrass, Kentucky bluegrass one for many, many years has been popular. Increasingly, we're seeing these Kentucky bluegrass turf type tall fescue ones. And then you're also seeing, some folks that are, mixing things like fine leaf fescues, Kentucky bluegrass, perennial ryegrass. So mixtures have an advantage in the sense that those are something that you can plant that hopefully is going to give you something across a wide range of soil types, sun, shade, all those other kinds of things. So we'll focus on some of that in this presentation. But down south, we might have some of the warm season grasses. Zoysia grass, Bermuda grass is not uncommon. But we tend to do more of the cool season work here at our research facility at Purdue. Difference between cool season and warm season, in short, the cool season grasses are going to have a longer period of green across the growing season. They're going to green up usually in March, and then we can retain color depending upon what happens with our winter months, certainly into, mid-December, you have reasonably good color. By the same token, the warm season grasses, particularly here in West Lafayette, they might have a period of at least 7 months where they're completely brown. And, most times people look at brown in their lawn and they think that something's wrong or unhealthy. It's not necessarily wrong or unhealthy. That plant's simply just gone dormant in a way to protect itself from, harsh winter conditions. But if somebody wanted a more sustainable lawn, one that didn't use as much fertilizer, water, all those kinds of things, zoysia grass is a great choice. But it does turn brown and it will creep into your neighbor's lawn. So if you're not careful and understand what's happening with that, you need to be aware of that. So just wanted to go over the different species and sort of, quick list of strengths and weaknesses here. Historically, like I said, lots and lots of lawns have been planted to Kentucky bluegrass. Oftentimes in these new subdivisions, they're sodding the front lawns with something like Kentucky bluegrass, and then they're seeding the backyards probably as a cost savings. But, one of the biggest advantages to Kentucky bluegrass is people generally like its color. It can have a very, very dark green color. But at the same time, you also need to understand there are some cultivars that are much lighter green in color. The other thing I think that people like about Kentucky bluegrass is it does mow pretty clean, meaning that if you don't have very sharp leaf blades, you still have a nice clean cut. It is probably one of our most cold tolerant grasses once it's established. So, those harsh winter conditions that we periodically get, you're not likely to lose Kentucky bluegrass, whereas something like perennial ryegrass and other grasses sometimes might disappear under very, very harsh winter conditions. Um, it does it does have very soft leaf blades. If you're gonna, put down a blanket for a picnic or something, it relative to some of the other grasses is much softer underneath your body, whether it's your feet or, your rear end you're putting down on the ground. So that's something to be thinking about. Sometimes people ask about. I'd say as far as, potential pitfalls or challenges with it, first and foremost, if you're establishing it from seed, it's like watching paint dry. Which is the reason, again, that you oftentimes will have people that are going to sod their front lawns because it's just a much quicker way to get the Kentucky bluegrass there. It's a much quicker way to stabilize soil. It can be relative to some of the other grasses, a little more shallow rooted. Most lawn grasses are going to root in that upper 8 to 18 inches of the soil, assuming it's not overly compacted. And Kentucky bluegrass is one of those ones that is going to be a little bit closer to the surface compared to things like our tall fescues. In general, as far as feeding with Kentucky bluegrass, it's a little bit of a prima donna and it likes to be fed. If you're looking for something that doesn't need to be fed as much, the fescues, whether it's the fine fescues or the tall fescues, they're going to require less nitrogen in order to, look their best throughout the growing season. And then there are a variety of different pests that are associated with Kentucky bluegrass. And most notably, again, back to my colleague, Dr. Doug Richmond, is they can be prone to white grubs, especially on irrigated sites. And so for that reason, Kentucky bluegrass, when you think about sustainable lawn species and the inputs associated with those particular grasses, a lot of people are putting down some sort of an insecticide on Kentucky bluegrass just because of the potential risk for white grubs. Some of our other grasses, not as much of an issue in terms of their insect problems. Again, some of the other things to think about with Kentucky bluegrass, like I said, it can be a little bit of a prima donna. It likes nice soils. So if you have a site that has really horrible soil, maybe they dug a basement, they took away the topsoil in the neighborhood, all those other kinds of things, and you're going to try and establish Kentucky bluegrass from seed, it is going to struggle even more. And so if somebody wants to seed Kentucky bluegrass into their lawn, we definitely suggest that they A, get a soil test, and B, do some sort of amendment to the soil prior to installing the seed. And so you can see in this situation, the contractor is actually putting in a layer of, that nice Indiana dark black dirt. And so that's a better environment for Kentucky bluegrass compared to that subsoil that you see underneath there. Then we get into perennial ryegrass. I mentioned this earlier, and we affectionately refer to perennial ryegrass as the grass we love to hate, and say that primarily because we love it because it germinates so quickly. There are these high quality cultivars that are really dark green in color, and some people really like those. It is one of those ones that if you want to do stripes on your lawn and everything, it responds really, really well to that kind of practice of mowing. As far as disadvantages, it can be one of those ones that doesn't mow as cleanly as our Kentucky bluegrass. Cultivar selection, cultivar selection, and the blend or whatever you use, you got to pay attention to that, and hopefully choosing newer cultivars. Something else, like I said about perennial ryegrass, it can be very, very disease susceptible. Both perennial ryegrass and Kentucky bluegrass, if you have moderate shade, they tend not to do very well. And then again, as you look at places where you're reducing the irrigation inputs, perennial ryegrass doesn't stay very happy for very long. And as far as its feeding needs, it's basically that same category as Kentucky bluegrass. It likes to be fed. You got to maintain the vigor in order for it to do its best. And this is just, again, some examples of, perennial ryegrass trial. This is actually a perennial ryegrass trial from the University of Kentucky, and you can see how important that cultivar selection is. There's one summertime disease of perennial ryegrass that can be very problematic. It's something called gray leaf spot. And gray leaf spot, the breeders have been increasing their emphasis on breeding for resistance to that disease, but it's still not perfect. But again, this is, Kentucky would have a little bit more of an issue with that particular disease than we would. But we have had some summers as well where it can be very extensive and very damaging to the perennial ryegrass. So perennial ryegrass by itself is something I would never recommend in a lawn. However, it can be a helpful additive to a mixture. And again, we'll move into some of these other species, but this is just an image I took a couple of years ago. We had some turf type tall fescue cultivar evaluations, and this strip in the middle is a border we placed with perennial ryegrass under a non-irrigated situation. So this is late summer, not getting a lot of rain, minimal irrigation inputs, and you can see the performance differences between the tall fescue and the perennial ryegrass. So it likes to be fed, likes to be irrigated. Switching gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the fescues. Remember, I mentioned that there are tall fescues and there are also these fine leaf fescues. And there's been a number of regional projects that have done quite a bit of work in the fine fescue world. And looking at everything from establishment to can we do better in terms of sod production to what are the nutritional needs? Is it compatible if you wanted to do, some sort of a grass clover lawn? So lots and lots of studies have been done with that, but realize that there's actually four different species of fine leaf fescue. So you've got your hard fescue, your sheep's fescue, your chewing's fescue, and you've got your creeping red fescue. And I'll put a little asterisk next to the creeping red fescue because the creeping red fescue, if you had a lawn that had some moderate shade, is oftentimes you will find that in some of the mixes because it's one of those art species that actually does pretty well under those circumstances of shade, not a lot of nitrogen inputs and everything that surrounds that. So just an awareness there. The other thing about the fine fescues is they have, like the name implies, very fine leaf blades. They also have very soft leaves, and that can be very attractive to some folks. And we kind of lump this group of grasses into that low maintenance category of lawn grasses, because actually the more you do to the fine fescues, the more water you put to them, the more nitrogen and other nutrients that you put towards them, they actually perform worse. And so while they don't need to not be fed at all, the more you do to them, if you try to manage them like a Kentucky bluegrass, they tend to not to be very happy at all. Again, just a couple different advantages, disadvantages that I hit on here. Something else where the fine fescues can sometimes be nice is in situations where people are actually growing them a little bit taller and looking for some of that attractive backdrop of the seed heads. So if you had an area that you're going to let grow up, maybe it's a border area and you wanted to get some visual contrast throughout the growing season, you can let these things grow up, and those seed heads look pretty nice when they sort of sway in the wind that we get here in the Midwest. But again, these are something to consider, especially for those low maintenance sites. And then we get into, why does it even matter? And we talk a little bit about, selection is plant selection, regardless of what you're doing, whether it's flowers or shrubs or trees or your lawn grasses. It's extremely important because choosing the right species is going to allow you to have fewer maintenance inputs. And again, we do lots and lots of evaluations of these cultivars under lots of different types of circumstances. Then we get into our tall fescues, and again, we've been increasingly really encouraging people to consider these for those lawns that are probably, if you had a bell-shaped curve, the vast majority of lawns would really benefit from having these turf type tall fescues in there. The breeders have been working pretty hard to try and make them more attractive in terms of both leaf texture and color. And in many situations, they're extremely compatible with Kentucky bluegrass, assuming you choose the right cultivar. The older cultivars didn't have as high a shoot density either, and so sometimes people didn't like that. But we've kind of been working through that again from some breeding efforts. And there is a summertime disease, and this was a big issue, Indianapolis and further north in the state this past summer that we don't typically see. But brown patch was rampant on tall fescue. And so I have a colleague here, her name is Dr. Jada Powlin, and her PhD dissertation here at Purdue examined all the different things surrounding brown patch because we saw that as one of the rate limiting steps to widespread adoption of this species. And in short, what she found was, cultivar host resistance was probably one of the most important things driving whether or not you saw the disease or not. And so if you wanted to do tall fescue and you're in an environment that is really hot and humid in the summer months, choosing the right cultivars tends to alleviate this problem pretty darn quick. All right, where did my clicker go? Okay, yep. So, and this is just an example of, these are all turf type tall fescues. This is one from one of our trials here at Purdue. This is a forage type. The forage type in that situation is actually Kentucky 31. Kentucky 31, that much lighter green color, wider leaf blade, less shoot density. And then you compare it to this one on the left-hand side. I mean, that to me looks like a rock star. I don't know that anybody would be disappointed in having a lawn that looked like that. I mean, look at the density, look at the color. And the nice thing about that is that with the tall fescues is you probably could use half the amount of nitrogen that you would for, a traditional Kentucky bluegrass lawn and still get this kind of a result. So if somebody is looking for something that maybe they're not going to have to feed quite as much, or maybe even have to water as much, these tall fescues are pretty strong in terms of their performance in a moderately maintained lawn. And like I said, this is an image from one of our, garden center areas here in town, and you see pallets of this Kentucky 31, and that's one of the ones that it looks like on the bag. Consumer, it's low maintenance, it's durable, it's soil adaptable, climate tolerant, weed disease resistant, all those fun things. It looks like, yeah, that's what I want to plant in my lawn. But if you're planting that in your lawn, this is what you're getting. And unfortunately, a lot of people are not going to be real satisfied with that. Really, no matter what you do, you're never going to make this grass look like this grass. It's all about the genetics. Now, by the same token, if you find some of these blends, for example, in this situation, we've got this Hound Dogs blend, which was literally on a pallet right next to the Kentucky 31, these are all improved turf type cultivars. So, trying to educate people to get the right grass into their lawns is a big part of this. And the cost differential, again, we're talking pennies per pound in terms of the cost differential to get the better quality turf type tall fescues. The other thing about the tall fescues is they're more tolerant to those poor soil conditions. So if you have a lawn, especially maybe a 10,000 or 15,000 square foot lawn, and you can't afford to do things like compost or add back topsoil and everything else, it's going to take a little bit to grow this thing in, but it's not going to be like watching paint dry, that compared to growing something in from Kentucky bluegrass. You're not going to have to feed it as much, and everything else associated with that. So pay attention to this. If anybody ever has questions, don't hesitate to reach out to myself or others and say, hey, I was thinking of getting tall fescue for my lawn. Where are some places I might be able to find some of these seed? The professional turf suppliers, the Site Ones, the Heritage Lawn and Landscape, all the places that are around the state, Advanced Turf, they oftentimes will actually sell to consumers. So if you know somebody that's renovating their lawn, it's actually they'll find more quality cultivars from those purveyors. They will also find cheaper prices compared to if you just walked into the Lowe's or the Home Depot or the wherever else you think you're going to go purchase some seed from. So if you know somebody that has a project coming up, again, we can get them in touch with some folks that are going to help them out and get them some of these, for lack of a better term, better ingredients.
Dr. Bigelow,
Yeah,
we have a question.
sure.
What germination percentage should be acceptable?
Normally with any of our cool season grasses, you're going to see something here, like on this seed tag, that's at least 85%. Okay. Now, the way the laws work around these things is if this seed is carried over, for whatever reason it didn't sell, is they'll have to come back and retest. And so in some situations, if it's sat on the pallet for 2 years for whatever reason, right, that germination is going to go down. And why that's important, Courtney, is, we talk about seeding rates, right? And if you have less germination and we had a target seeding rate, you're actually going to have to use more seed because there's some non-viable seeds that are there. So, but usually a seed that's within the last 12 months of being harvested is going to have 80 to 85, oftentimes 90% germination. And that's a good thing to be looking for.
Thank you.
Sure. Anything else before I sort of just transition a little bit here on the species? Okay. This is a common question, seed it versus sod it. And, a lot of things that are going to happen with that is, it's what did you have as far as when are you going to plant the grass, and how quickly do you need things to stabilize the soil? So, like I said, a lot of neighborhoods seems like anymore they're sodding the front lawns to try and stabilize the soil, provide a nice aesthetic as people drive through these neighborhoods, and then they're going and they're seeding the backyards. But sod can really be put down anytime that the soil's not frozen. Sodding right now is perfectly fine. Sometimes even sodding in January. I've seen some contractors that have had to do that for whatever reason. Seeding's a lot more tricky, especially our cool season grasses. Plus, you need to have access to irrigation for this to be most successful, right? And so our optimal timings for seeding is usually that late summer time frame is what we oftentimes are going to suggest. But here's just another example of you sod something and here you go. It's instantly green. It's all good to go. In some situations, again, this is a cost conservation kind of thing. Somebody had done some work here on this drainage swale, and they did actually, one of sort of our suggested best management practices here is they actually vegetated. They put a grassed waterway, if you will, like we see in the ag side of things. And for cost savings, they seeded outside the grassed waterway. And so there's not necessarily a right or a wrong answer, but you also know that when we sod, we oftentimes have less challenges for establishment, and we also have less potential for weed encroachment. Sodding in this situation versus seeding, seeding over here, something else we oftentimes suggest is if you can, you want to mulch these things. Straw mulch, there's paper mulch, there's blankets, there's lots and lots of options there, but anything you can do to try and improve water retention in the soil is going to promote maximum establishment from seed. Again, here's just an example, neighborhood where they've sodded the front yard and they've actually seeded the backyard. Now, this was Kentucky bluegrass sod in the front. The backyard actually had a lot of perennial ryegrass in that seed. And so in that particular situation, there might be some visual incompatibilities, but they're actually pretty close. But there's also going to be some differences in terms of those nutritional requirements over time, trying to get this to grow in and be as consistent as it is to the front yard. But again, we see this so many times with our developers, and there's reasons that they do it, but it does create some challenges down the road, especially if somebody doesn't feed this seeded area very well over time. This will oftentimes not look so good. So other stuff just wanted to talk on. Like I said, there's lots of challenges, people establishing lawns, particularly new lawns, and you can see this soil is definitely not very good. There's all sorts of debris in the soil. Also, the color of it's light, so that topsoil has been removed and taken somewhere else. And I talked about some of the challenges different grasses might have in that situation. But unfortunately, what also seems to happen is a contractor comes in and just rolls new sod across this and hopes for the best. And that's not ideal. That's not fair to the customer. So soil testing, I think, is really, really helpful in those situations. And going and taking some soil samples and trying to understand if there's some deficiencies. Many times in a lot of these new construction soils, what we really see is a pretty serious lack of things like phosphorus. Oftentimes there will even be, sometimes a little bit of a lack of things like potassium. For example, here's a potassium deficiency. And so anytime that there's a deficiency in things like phosphorus and potassium and you're seeding into that soil, that's where you really are going to struggle. Because if that plant doesn't have the nutrients it needs, it lacks vigor, it doesn't fill out, it doesn't get the density that it needs, it's more pest prone, it's more prone to drought and everything else that's there. So, getting that soil test, it costs about 10 or 12 bucks. And, that's going to give you some insight of what you should be doing. So anything else in that space? I'll just kind of keep moving here. Questions?
I think we're looking pretty good.
Okay. Again, here's another example, new construction, somebody's gone in, they've gotten some compost, and the contractors kind of tried to mix it into the soil a little bit, just trying to improve some things. And one of the advantages of that is when you're adding something like a compost or some of this organic matter to these new sites, is that actually provides some background nutrition too. In addition, that organic matter is going to hold a little bit more moisture. And that can be helpful in terms of trying to germinate and establish your turfgrass plants from seed. So again, this isn't somebody's actually spent a little bit of time and effort, getting this right. They probably could have added a little bit more of the darker material here, but it is what it is, and just kind of move forward with that.
Hey, Dr.
When we talk
Bigelow,
about nutrition, what's that?
quick question. We did have another question in the chat box about when adding compost, should it be more on top or should you try to work that in?
Ideally, if you can work it in, and it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be really aggressive. You could go out there with, a garden tiller and try and get, a nice uniform incorporation across, the upper 6 inches. But, in this situation, they might have done, very light tilling, and then they've come back with some sort of a drag or a rake and, just kind of mixed it in. But, anything you get into those really poor soils is going to be at least a little bit of a help. So, but ideally, if you could mix it deeper, but, the practicality, that isn't always there.
Thank you.
On the nutrition side, if you go to our webpage, turf.purdue.edu, you'll find a few things in terms of some resources, and these are some publications that we put together over the years. And the left-hand side, that's some guidelines for feeding your lawns. Right-hand side, we oftentimes do get a lot of questions about phosphorus, because phosphorus does sometimes move and does have the potential to create some issues with water quality. So we put together a nice little fact sheet for that. But again, if you have a soil test and it shows you've got some deficiencies, you probably should be using some phosphorus. By the same token, if you don't have deficiencies, then perhaps buying a nitrogen only fertilizer is going to be okay as well. And then back to the general feeding of mature lawns. We talk about these things on the left-hand side, the 4 R's, right? The right amount of fertilizer, the right source, the right timing, and then the right placement. Getting it off a hardscape and paying attention to water quality things is a pretty important part of that. When we talk about the right timing, oftentimes if you look at these calendars, and we've got sort of low maintenance, 2 medium maintenance, and a high maintenance options, but feeding across the growing season, depending upon what you're trying to do, and targeting one of these total amounts. A lot like, if you were paying attention to your diet, and if it's that 2,000 calories a day is okay, how do I spend my 2,000 calories? Do I do 2,000 calories with a bunch of donuts first thing in the morning? Probably not. But we want to have some sort of sustained energy across the day with our diet. Same thing happens with our feeding of our lawns. Some sort of a sustained feeding across the growing season, slow and steady wins the race. And then getting people to actually apply things correctly. You can see this lawn here that's been streaked. That's one of those consumer grade retail drop spreaders. It's about 21 inches wide, and if somebody's using one of those, they're real excited when they make about 2 passes, and then suddenly they look at the other 9,000 square feet of their lawn and they're like, this is no fun. And so if you're going to put down granular fertilizers, something like the small rotary spreaders tend to be a little bit better. That's going to you're going to be able to do it a little bit faster and more efficiently, and you're also going to minimize some of this streaking that's happening here. But regardless of what you put down, pay attention to the hardscape. If those particles do get on the hardscape, take out a little leaf blower or something, or broom, something, get those particles off the hardscape and into the turf, because we are always very, very conscious of being the best stewards that we can for water quality. Other stuff here, again, lots of different programs, and what's your goal? Is it a high performance goal? Is it, couch potato goal? Paying attention to not feeding too much, paying attention to water quality. All those things are going to be things that, we should be considering. The other thing is the feeding program for a brand new seeded lawn is going to be different than that same lawn 5 years later. And in general, that seeded lawn is going to benefit from some more steady feeding across the growing season, every 4 to 5 weeks, just very gently. at smaller amounts. Whereas, once you have a mature lawn, you can probably do a spring application, a summer application, and then we like to see something in that September, October timeframe if we can. Again, nitrogen versus fall nitrogen. That fall nitrogen, that's usually essentially the 1st of September all the way through a little around Halloween or slightly after Halloween is usually when we generally recommend people kind of pull off the gas pedal on their nutrition. We don't like to see things going into too far into things like November, because the plant's just not growing as much and it's probably not going to take up those nutrients. So but we do like to see fall nitrogen, some sort of fall nitrogen put down. And then we get questions about, what happens if I don't feed or fertilize my lawn? Well, this is a great example. Okay, so this is, similar to what I showed you by, a new neighborhood where they sodded the front lawns and then they seeded the backyard. And what you see here is actually a high component of perennial ryegrass that was not fed after being seeded. And so what do we see there? Jeff, what are those wide leaves?
I'm looking at, what is that, buckhorn plantain?
Sure looks like buckhorn plantain, which isn't always the easiest weed for somebody to control. I mean, there's a lot of commercial products that you can clean this up, and in this situation, a homeowner could buy one of those hose end sprayers, with some sort of a weed control product, and they can go out there and hose these weeds down, and the weeds will go away. But the reality of that is, if they don't come back and feed this lawn, give it the nutrition that it needs to get dense and healthy, is what's likely to happen. It's likely that those weeds are going to come right back, because there's a lot of seeds that have been dispersed from these weeds. And so, this again, pretty simple to take care of. Feed it, spring, a little bit in the summer. Definitely, if this were somebody's lawn, they were asking me what to do, and this is a picture they showed me in August, I say, feed it 2 to 3 times, about 4 or 5 weeks apart, through the fall months, and you're going to have a better lawn the next spring, that's going to have less crabgrass, less broadleaf weeds, and it's probably going to make you, a little bit more happy in terms of its performance. Other stuff. How am I doing on time, Jeff?
You're doing great. You're doing great.
Okay. I'm gonna move forward to a couple other things, just to kind of talk a little bit about, we talked about, the different nutrients. We tend to focus our programs on nitrogen applications. And if you go to, say, like an Ace Hardware or something like that, certainly you can get some pretty good advice from some place like, Ace Hardware, Do It Best, or, those folks seem to, be very helpful in terms of helping you select products. Some of if you wanted to do it yourself, some of the companies that put together sort of these programs of step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. And you can kind of see, based on what I've been describing here, is in a lot of situations is, you're going to have that spring feeding. Maybe you're going to have a late spring feeding, a little bit in the summer, and then definitely something in the fall. And the products that are in the bags might even vary a little bit depending upon what they're recommending or suggesting across the growing season. And in that same conversation, we look at different types of fertilizers. You can go into those fertilizer aisles and be a little bit mystified by what's actually happening in terms of which product should I get. Starter fertilizers like this, that's something that you maybe would be using at establishment, particularly at seeding. And the benefit here is oftentimes, like I showed you, it's not uncommon. A lot of our soils will have some low phosphorus contents, especially if they're not the best soils that you find in some of these construction situations. And so that's going to benefit those young seedlings. But then you would transition out of this product, and in theory, you might move to something that looks like one of these or one of these. That's got a little bit higher nitrogen, much less phosphorus, much less potassium, and unfortunately, as some people will actually purchase these to feed their mature lawns. And, these are, general purpose. You'll see them listed sometimes as garden fertilizers, all those other kinds of things. They tend to be priced per bag. Much less, maybe half the cost of this. But the reality is, if we look at this number, 12, versus this number, 27, is which one has more nitrogen? Well, this one up here has more nitrogen. So while this bag might cost more, is it actually could potentially cover a greater area. So you might only need 1 bag of these, and you might actually need 3 bags of these. Plus you're paying for maybe something you don't need. If you did your soil test and you said, hey, phosphorus, potassium levels are fine, is you probably don't need to pay extra money for these particular nutrients. The other thing is when you purchase some of these lawn maintenance fertilizers, oftentimes they will have some controlled release nitrogen, like a sulfur coated or polymer coated urea in there. And that's going to give you a longer duration of feeding. Usually you can get 6 to 8 weeks of greening and growth out of a product like this. This particular product, you would oftentimes usually get about 4 weeks of greening and growth out of that. Plus, if you're inexperienced in terms of your application, this would be a product where you might get the potential for more tip burn by unintentionally over applying this product versus this product. Is that helpful?
Sure thing.
Jeff, I just looked at my watch and I'm at 12:45. I mean,
You nailed it. You got her good.
Okay.
I was gonna ask because I can't remember if you had done research on this. As educators in our county, we're having a lot of folks who are not focused so much on pure grass. Have you done any work with micro clover?
Yes, we have actually done, this idea, the idea there, Jeff, the genesis of that, when this was definitely a much hotter topic, was this idea of what we call a self-feeding lawn. This idea that the clover would fix nitrogen from the atmosphere and return that into the turf and benefit not only the clover that's growing there, but also the grasses that are growing there. We had some success with that. One of the things that we also learned, and it was only about a 3-year study, for whatever reason, as we got to the end of year 2, it's like some of that clover actually melted out, or maybe there was a disease or something that happened over the winter. So the take-home message to me from that particular study is, this might be a feasible option for some people. However, you also need to be prepared that it may be necessary to reintroduce the clover on a regular basis. Like I showed you earlier, there's lots of things we can do as far as interseeding or overseeding, right? But if you wanted a nice uniform poly stand of grass and clover, it's feasible, but it's not no maintenance after you plant it.
Gotcha. No, that's helpful.
Yeah.
We did have a question pop up in terms of how much nitrogen would I want to put on a new lawn if I'm wanting to protect the beneficial insects in the lawn?
Ooh, I don't know that I've ever had that question, Jeff. I think I would stay with our guidelines. I would go to that fact sheet. I don't know that there's any negative effects. I think if you go back to what we just talked about, certainly if you wanted to maintain some plants that were pollinator friendly, excessively fertilizing with nitrogen might start to crowd out the legumes over time. But I think if you were gently feeding, say, 2 pounds total of nitrogen per year, you probably would be able to maintain that poly stand. And again, if you're thinking of your beneficial insects or your pollinators, you're going to be able to maintain some of those flowering plants in the lawn.
Awesome. I guess another question, because we did have a fairly extensive drought, what would that translate to in terms of when I'm looking at lawns in the spring? Do you have kind of a prediction of how much damage will carry over through the winter since there wasn't as much root growth, overwinter storage? I'm kind of clenching because I am nervous that just the stress of all that is going to reduce the survival rate over winter.
I don't disagree. I think we definitely have some vulnerable turf areas out there, that maybe weren't able to get all the energy that they needed to make it through the winter. So I would not be surprised if there are some, and then they will likely present as localized areas next spring, for whatever reason. Maybe it's a little bit of a slope, or, maybe even an area that, gets wet over the winter, and we might see some thinning of some of those areas. Now, the lemonade in the glass there, Jeff, the lemonade to this is, because that lawn is actually thin, because those less resilient turf grass species were stressed out last summer, this is a great opportunity to go in there and split seed some of these better grasses into it, right? You may need to adjust what you're going to do as far as your pre-emergence herbicide and transition from granular sources to, some sort of post-emergent control to try and encourage these spring seedings. But I do think that we're going to have some stress. It's always fun to take pictures, right?
Right, and I did kind of bait you with that question because for those on the call today and those who are listening, there's never just one thing that's affecting your turf. The number of factors is always, 5, 10, just many different things going into the health of that stand.
And Jeff, to your point, those areas that for whatever reason, maybe it's an area that somebody's using, we have it here on campus, where before a home football game, people park cars in their front yard, right? And so those kinds of traffic situations on a non-irrigated or extremely dry lawn, that can be an additional factor, right?
Oh yeah. Question come up. It says, I have sand topped with compost lightly mixed in. What method of planting works best in the spring? Do I need to till, frost seed? Recommendations for that.
I think, what they just said there, that description of frost seeding, we would call it dormant seeding, I guess. That with a nice thin layer of the compost across the top, I mean, if it's an existing lawn, you can't just go in there and usually till things. But what you could do is you could do some sort of a core aeration event across that, open it up and allow some of that compost to filter down into the soil and, poke the holes, add the seed, add the compost, and cross your fingers and hope for the best.
Excellent. So I'm going to, well, first off, thank you, Dr. Bigelow, for having us. I'm going to stop the recording.